Welcome, Kumar. Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the privilege of hosting Kumar Garg, the co-founder and president of Renaissance Philanthropy, which aims to fuel a 21st century renaissance by supporting philanthropists and foundations in developing ambitious strategies, leveraging science, technology, and innovation. Previously, Kumar served as vice president of partnerships at Smith Futures before he spent 8 years at White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Obama administration, where he spearheaded the Educate to Innovate campaign with more than $1 billion in philanthropic investment, the State of the Union initiative to train 100,000 STEM teachers to bring computer science to all K-12 students, and created the White House Science Fair. Kumar began his career as a lawyer, advocating for educational reform. He holds a BA from Dartmouth and a JD from Yale Law School. So we will begin with approximately 45 to 50 minutes of questions, and then we will open up to Q&A to the audience. Kumar, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. To start off, I would like to ask, since Renaissance Philanthropy's launch less than a year ago in May 2024, you rapidly scaled in such a dynamic startup-like manner, and you already launched so many significant initiatives with partnerships in the US and the UK, such as the AI for Math Fund to accelerate discoveries in math and the Public Benefit Innovation Fund to drive technological solutions to improve social service delivery. So I'm very curious, what strategies and organizational principles have enabled your rapid scale up? Because it's so in contrast with traditional philanthropies, which are often criticized for being slow and not efficient.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that one of the sort of probably unfair advantages we have is just that um, you know, we were starting on top of a body of work that we had started many years prior. So as you said, I started working in science technology in the Obama administration. And one of my views when I was working for the president was to really see the office as a platform. Our job was to find the most interesting ideas in science technology that were happening in the country and saying, what is the role that the administration could do to accelerate those ideas? So I've been collecting ideas and doers for a long time. And then when I was working for Eric, um, you know, he had a really wide mandate, for how to build out that philanthropy, which was, like I want to use the resources to help the most talented science and technologists do the most. And so we took that mandate really seriously and really thought about both how do we build new systems for supporting those scientists? So things like focused research organizations and the creation of convergent research to we created a fellows program that was trying to find mid-career folks who are doing really impactful ideas. So we've been sort of on this journey on what I sort of think of as like, you know, three parts of the triangle, finding really compelling hypotheses, like theses of how what is the future that we want and how do we get there? Who is the talented leader who can get us there? And then what is the capital they need? And so one of the things that when we were starting Renaissance said was, there's like a missing production function for that kind of work. One of the things I tell people is that if you take a step back on science and tech philanthropy, it kind of has two lanes. It has the kind of the $1 million lane, which is researchers raising money for their labs, kind of research funding, and then it has this like $1 billion lane, which is like institutions raising through capital campaigns for the building, the institute, for their larger, like large scale efforts. But there's actually a lot of really compelling science technology that sits in the middle. It's the how do we accelerate this field by building a next set of AI data sets and benchmarks? It's the coordinated research program that brings researchers from multiple universities together. It's the commercialization strategies for the ideas that's stuck in the lab. It's market shaping to like, think about, what products are not getting built. It's, thinking about the intersection with policy. And often it's just like who's putting that together is like this open question. And so we said, in a lot of areas, mid-scale science is kind of where there's a huge amount of value. But to do mid-scale science, you need to find the strategy. What's the big if true idea of where you can get? Who's the person to lead it? And then how do we? And so we said, well, we should make that the Renaissance production function to actually bring together what we consider philanthropic funds. So a 3-year fund, a 5-year fund, where there's a fund leader, there's an OKR that drives the fund strategy. We want to, you know, transform middle school math using AI and deliver, tutoring that is under $1,000 per kid, but doubles the rate of learning. So what's the OKR that the fund is focused around? Who's going to lead it? And then who's going to be who are going to be the LPs? Who are going to be the donors who put the resources in? And so I think part of the reason why we sort of have found a lot of momentum is just that I think there's like an appetite for that type of model where you can attract these field leaders, build a strategy around a big thesis, and then go to donors and say, do you want to back that thesis? Um, and so we've been, getting interest both among on the talent side and on the resources side. And so, you know, we these leaders are motivated to then push, and so we've then been able to get these programs off the ground pretty quickly.
Speaking of donors, one of the founding missions of Renaissance Philanthropy is to mobilize today's tech billionaires and high net worth individuals to support science and transformative science, much like the patrons did during the Renaissance. So, given the inherent risks and uncertainties of ambitious scientific research, how do you balance the desire for measurable or short-term outcomes that the donors usually have with the need for sustained long-term investment that is needed to successfully carry out scientific research to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of our hypotheses is just that um, more people should be working on what we think of as growing the denominator, which is what is the overall amount of science and tech related giving that is happening. So I think a lot of times people focus their energy on convincing the folks who are already giving to care about the thing that they want to work on. But if you take a step back, I think the big thing you sort of notice is just that there's a lot of dry powder, right? So there was a Bridgespan study that we often cite, which was a couple years ago, which sort of surveyed and said of the 2,000 families that have more than $500 million of wealth that are in the U.S., their effective giving rate was 1.2%. And when they interviewed a number of them, they said, "Well, I'm busy. I'm still professionally active. Setting up a philanthropy takes a lot of work. And they said the deal flow is not, the ideas that I'm coming across, I don't find that compelling. But I think of those as two sides of the same coin, which is just that they're not yet ready to become philanthropists as a career. But they have lots of other obligations. Are there ways that they could be deploying that philanthropic capital, but with small amounts of cognitive load? And so we sort of say, you just like on your investment side, you deploy into, venture capital funds or, hedge funds or others, you should be deploying into philanthropic funds where there's a clear leader, there's a clear strategy, and you're making a decision. Do I agree with the strategy and the leader? And what's the resources it needs to succeed? And our sort of at least view is that, maybe that gets more folks off the sidelines because we're not making them change their day, but we are changing the rate at which they're deploying capital. And so if that ends up extending the denominator, we think that sort of has like this extra value in being able to drive the overall space.
How has your work been received by the legacy established philanthropies and agencies and governmental funding agencies? Like how much of your work is and like disrupting, so to speak, their funding landscape versus how much is it collaborating with them and complementing these legacy organizations?
Yeah, I mean, so far it's been quite complementary. We found a lot of interest from well-established foundations. I think partly because I think when I've asked them, they say that this feels complementary and just like a nice way to diversify their portfolio. So, this happens in the investment world where you have the equivalent of direct investing, where you're directly investing in startups or various projects, and then you also are an LP into various funds. And that's considered very normal. You learn through the LP side as to what you should be doing on the direct investing side. And so they said the same thing, which is, oh, when we're putting money into one of your funds, maybe that helps us get smarter on an emerging science and tech topic, and maybe then we'll build a program in-house, or maybe we won't. But it gives us optionality. So I think what they're getting is different. I think for an emerging donor, it's actually a way to get started. It's a way to start to deploy, and maybe that's the way you keep deploying into multiple funds. For an existing donor, maybe it's a nice way to diversify and be able to experiment into various topics without having to take on a lot of the front load of building out a team and recruiting a leader and everything else. So it's been quite complementary. And then I think on governments, we have a pretty active partnership with ARIA, which is a new research and invention agency in the UK, and they've been excellent partners for us. They're really interested in supercharging the UK R&D ecosystem, and I think what they really, we're one of their activation partners, and what we work with them on is, you know, how do we find the most how do we both find the topics that are most interesting for where British science and tech could go, but then how do we find the next generation of leaders, scientific leaders who could drive those programs? So we launched this program with their support called the Big If True Science Accelerator. And basically the idea behind it is, researchers, when you say like, what's your big idea? A lot of researchers will just say, uh, my joke is like, it's like 10x my lab. It's like just whatever I'm doing bigger, like my lab could be bigger. I could be, but that's actually not what, donors or government agencies are asking. What they want is, what is the thing that if we figured out could allow this whole field to move faster, to go into new directions? Like, what are the rate limiting steps that are holding the field back? Convergent Research just earlier this week, um, and now, released this huge gaps report for like, what are the gaps? Like, if we could figure out this area, it could really accelerate an overall field. That's kind of and so part of the point of this Big If True Science Accelerator is to say to PIs, can we actually, you might have an inkling of that. Can we give you basically the equivalent of a 14-week course and cohort support to say, is there an ARPA style program that's hiding inside your work for the big if true idea for your field? And then I think a subset of those people might go then work at ARIA, where ARIA then gives them budget to run programs. They could work at any of the ARPAs. They could become a fund leader with us. But for us, we consider that to be a really important public asset, which is helping scientists sort of, not just do the scientific road mapping, but then say, here's like my attack vector. Like, if we could figure out, if we had a really high dimensional tool, or if we had the right data set, or if we had this, set of researchers with from these disciplines really deeply working together, we could really solve this problem.
Speaking of ARPAs, like we already know DARPA is the model for mission-oriented research funding, but what other government funding programs with innovative models have been successful but are not really known or studied? And related to that, I would like to ask, what are some underrated or lesser known success stories of effective philanthropy that inspire you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, um, I mean, one of the real advantages of the US scientific enterprise, one that is under a lot of stress right now, is just that it actually has a range of different models, right? So the US scientific enterprise includes the ARPA model, like DARPA, ARPA-H, and others. It includes, you know, basically these open calls, open RFP model that like the National Science Foundation. It includes an actual labs model where you actually house the researchers and give them access to cutting edge equipment like the national labs or the intramural research that NIH does. It um, and so there's actually a range of different ways that the government actually supports the scientific community. It includes things like SBIR to commercialize that research. So um, there's actually like, if you sort of think about what are America's flagship companies, you can actually draw really interesting links between some of the most important technologies we have today and some part of the federal science and tech enterprise. So, like modern day solar power. Well, the photovoltaic was actually an invention that came out of the national labs. Or Google, the the that was graduate work that was supported by the National Science Foundation. Or, um, Waymo and autonomous cars actually came out of work that DARPA supported through the Autonomous Car Challenge, which then, became the team that eventually became Waymo. So there's actually a lot of interesting linkages from individual areas of research from the enterprise, and then like things we actually see today. I mean, there's a whole list of things that NASA supported as part of the space race that ended up becoming like the microwave, that ended up becoming everyday technologies. Um, so I think we really benefit from that. I think part of the reason why we've really focused in on the ARPA model is that um, this this is a way of sort of approaching problem solution design that is a very powerful way to accelerate fields. And so, DARPA does that in particular areas that have strong relationships to, things that are interesting to the DoD. But as a methodology, we think there's a lot of spillover potential to take that same methodology, and that's why you're sort of seeing that interest in things like ARPA-H and other ARPA style models. I think on your second question around philanthropy, Open Philanthropy actually did this great service to the field where they actually went back and looked at case studies of philanthropy. Like, let's look back at the past 100 years and look at some of the wins, and it's really instructive to like look back at like, you know, Warren Weaver, his contribution to what then became molecular biology, or the work that happened on the Green Revolution. So they did a great job of like what are some of these huge wins, and what you often find is that there's some intersection between topics that are relatively neglected or are just very early, but then by getting them going, they sort of connect to policy or they connect to what government can do. So it seems like often with philanthropy, like there's a huge value in um I think thinking about like the negative space, what isn't happening that if you sort of got going could have a big impact.
Given that there are so many recent changes in governmental funding agencies and university research funding, has that created new opportunities for innovative funding organizations like Renaissance Philanthropy to take up more space, or has it created a backlog of organizations like yours?
I mean, I think that um the sort of current um I think the current sort of policy sort of actions that are happening on science are quite negative. I think whether it's STEM talent that is international, that is in the United States, whether it's the like kind of on-off pauses in research funding. So I think it's causing a huge amount of chaos and lack of certainty, and it's very hard to then expect researchers to be able to like design and launch ambitious experiments. So I think I'm a big fan of what the meta science community has worked on, which is we should be having more structured experimentation in how we give money. But I don't think like just chaos is a good experiment generally. Um, I think that um, you know, for us, it's like a little bit of a mixed bag, which is that on one level, like we really do believe in the federal role, the public role that exists in the United States, but also in other countries in supporting science. So there's just no way that one should think about philanthropy being a substitute. And in fact, like I said, the best, most impactful areas of philanthropic work have been where they're catalytic to what the public sector takes up. So for us, like a public sector that is, you know, like not working, what does not sort of meet the model. I do think that, you know, there is a strong desire for people in the science community to like continue to be creative in this current moment. And so there's a lot more active interest to sort of look at other models for how to, you know, finance their ambitious ideas. And so, we do get a lot more interest, whether it's from donors or from talent or from, you know, you know, uh, folks outside the United States, like the UK, the British government, and others, because those are people are looking to be creative. So it has created a lot of opportunity, but I don't I don't think I'm also of the believer, as someone who served as a senior executive in the government, that like the public role in the science and tech enterprise is really important.
In progress studies and meta science, we hear that traditional science funding is criticized for reinforcing inequality among institutions and researchers through favoring the established organizations, institutions, or researchers. How do you design initiatives to counteract this inequality and broaden participation and ensure funding reaches a greater diverse range of innovators and institutions? And I want to add to that question. Well, unproven or young talent can be a riskier bet. So, how do you allocate your portfolio to these different levels of talent?
I mean, I think that it's thinking about talent is just really important. I think is the first part, which is, I think, for example, a large part of what makes the US a science and technology leader is the fact that it's able to attract all of this incredible STEM talent from around the world for graduate study, for postdocs, and for building their companies. So I think like being a magnet for talent is really important. I think a second part is that um, there's just a lot of biases that are like that really can vary even by domain in science around like how ageist a field is, which is like when does it think that you are worth your salt? So, like computer science, for example, has historically been um, a field that is quite open to younger talent, like being treated as at the frontier, right? Like, hey, you can showcase your skills, you can be doing cutting edge work very early in your career. Biology, on the other hand, has historically been a field where, there's a sense of like, you're not credible until you've finished your PhD, you've worked in this lab, you've done all these things. And you sort of see that even in the funding cycles where the age of getting that first big NIH award, is like 43 years old before, so that's quite, dramatic as a change between like, senior engineers doing cutting edge research at Anthropic are 24 years old and you're getting your first major award in biology at 44 years old. Like that's a big difference. Um, and so I think one, we have to sort of recognize if a field, a subfield of science has this huge age discrepancy, what are the steps we're going to take to be able to bet on younger talent, and what are we doing on that? I think is a big question. And then I think on what are ways to find that talent, what are the ways to bet on that talent? I mean, there are, we've experimented with so many, and there's no one right answer, but you can start with small grants, micro grants, and then show what people can. So you can um, uh, engage in more teaming, so that they can actually show their product, what their capabilities are. There's an organization called Nucleate, which specifically focuses on really, students who are very talented in biology but are, much younger, and says like, how can we provide you the coaching and support so you could actually be biotech entrepreneurs, at a much younger ages, and they've had a ton of success. So I think there's lots of ways to think about selection um, and support, but I think a key part is just recognizing the problem and just trying to attack it in lots of ways and figuring out if you can um, just create more avenues for folks who are early in their career to raise their hand and show what they're capable of.
My co-host was able to join, so I'd like to introduce him, Berke, with great technical difficulty. Welcome. And I would like to pass the next question to him.
Kumar, thank you very much for joining us. So, as far as I can see, Renaissance Philanthropy views agenda setting as something that's really important. So, I just want to ask, like, in the context of what Renaissance Philanthropy does, how do you exactly define agenda setting? What do you exactly mean by that? And do you think agenda setting or agenda setters is something that's undersupplied?
Yeah, I mean, all these things are just words, but a lot of what we mean by agenda setting is that there's a bias that humans have, which is they sort of assume that somebody else probably has looked at all of this and decided that the things that are being treated as important are the most important. Like, oh, there was a meeting. We like listed all the things, and the things that people are working on, that's what's more important. But I think what you, at a practical level, need to realize is just everything is very historically contingent. So I'll give an example. So one of the things I've been working on over multiple years is trying to have the global health community take lead remediation, getting lead as a pollutant out of, as a toxin out of lots of things more seriously. And, this is not like a secret. Like the research on lead as a toxin for brain development, for a huge number of other ailments is like pretty extensive. It's existed for 40 years. It's why we got lead out of gasoline and everything else. But if you sort of like went back 5 or 7 years, the number of people who were actively working on this in global health was minuscule. You count them on a single hand, you know? And I couldn't really understand because there were a couple of groups that were working on it, and they would show you these statistics about the fact that, by some estimates, 1 in 3 kids in India has, has lead poisoning. And I was like, 1 in 3 kids, in India has lead poisoning? Like that's a huge number given what we know, about what it does to brain development. And, like I would hear about a lot of other public health topics. And you've seen like in the past few years, we started doing some grant making in this area. We started, you've just seen like a sea change where, Center for Global Development did a major study that actually showed that maybe a quarter or more of learning gains between rich and poor countries could be just explained by lead exposure. If you just decrease the amount of lead pollution, that by it alone would be the equivalent of 1/4 of the difference in of learning gains. And then a number of other studies, and that led to, under the Biden administration, a major initiative by USAID on lead remediation. You've now had a number of philanthropists and had major lead funds. It's become much more of like a topic, and I've gone back and I've asked like what was the blind spot? And one sort of theory I've gotten is just that the global health community mostly thinks about disease, right? There's a lot of diseases that kill a lot of people and stun a lot of kids. And so a lot of it has actually been just focused on diseases. And lead is not a disease, right? It's a pollutant. And a lot of the pollution work has focused on other things. So it's like it just kind of fell through, right? The usual ways that the community was organizing itself. But now like lots of people at very senior levels across the global health community take this very seriously. So agenda setting is like not taking the status quo as a fixed view of what is important and saying, hey, like there might be need to raise the elevation of a particular issue and to figure out that there's a set of tractable things that one could actually do on it. Because I think the second part of this is just humans have a bias for, well, if there's nothing to do that I can do on it, maybe I'm just going to like undervalue the topic itself. So one of the things that happened in lead was there's an organization called LEAP. And one of the things that they did to sort of show how tractable this is an issue is they would fly to a country, they would go to the open market, and they would buy paint off the open market. And they would just, put out sheets of it and then, like let it dry out and then do lead tests on the paint. And then they would just go to the local authorities if they found lead and say, did you know that there's lead in the paint, the new paint, the stuff people are buying and putting on their walls? There's lead in there. And in like 8 countries, just that step caused the paint producers to change the mixtures. They didn't realize that there was lead in there, and the regulators to start to like much more actively screen. So like, this is like tens of thousands of dollars. It's a plane flight, buying the paint, doing the meeting, potentially having, a decreasing lead exposure for hundreds of thousands of children, right? So in my mind, that's like wild, right? But like, it also gave policymakers the sense like, we should be doing more here, right? Like, so I think this idea of both elevating neglected topics and showcasing their tractability, that there's something to be done, is a very important role you can play. It's just scientists can do this too, where they can say, this is an area where we now have the opportunity to go after this problem in a new way, and here's the way to do it. And so, so that part, just that voice, that speech act of this is important and here's how we can solve it. People I think sometimes undervalue because, you haven't done it yet, but you have to always remember that um, uh, a great line someone said to me was, um, can you flip somebody from why to why not? Right? So if you can flip someone after they hear your idea to be like, why aren't we doing this? Like you've really moved them a lot, you know? So that's a lot of what agenda setting is, which is switching people from why to why not.
Thank you very much for that. And I actually work part-time for lead exposure elimination project. So indeed, the work they're doing is just fantastic. A related, some sort of a follow-up question I want to ask is, so lead exposure was this thing that very few people worked on. Again, the evidence was there. People did know the scale of the problem, but you just didn't have agenda setters or an agenda that funders could fund or advocates and researchers could work on. What I want to ask is like, is there any other area within global health that you think is the like potentially the next lead exposure in the sense that there's this like very large problem where we have clear evidence about the scale of the problem, and there are some potential solutions that is replicable across contexts, but you just don't have agenda setters or you just don't have the attention there.
So like another example that I came across recently, and I have somebody who we've been talking to who wants to work on this, is like potassium. So there's a body of research that suggests that maybe a quarter of all heart disease is attributed to a potassium deficiency. People just don't get enough of it in their diet. So researchers have a solution for it. You can actually add potassium to salt, just like we, fortified salt like 80 years ago. You can fortify salt with potassium. And it has a pretty direct impact in cardiovascular disease. And in some instances, in some countries, they've even taken the step of just requiring it. In some instances, you can get it, but it's not available. So what this person is like, why aren't we just pushing harder on making this the baseline salt offering? It would like knock out like potassium deficiency as a cause of cardiovascular disease, which in multiple countries is a real driver. So in my mind, like when I push on this, like the research is there and everything else, it's just like not on the radar screen. And so in my mind, like, there are things that sometimes people know deep within a particular community. And if you go find that community, they're like, of course, we have known this. But like you sort of level out into the broader community and it is not known. I mean, in some ways, like pandemics were like this, right? Where people would say, oh, like we've been worrying about disease X for a while. But then, you sort of widen out and then people are like, you know, are you telling me like nobody's been, so um, sometimes what you're doing is finding the what is considered as common knowledge in a subfield, but recognizing that like, you know, just because they've been saying it to each other does not mean that it has salience in a broader community.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful answer. Laura, please.
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit to AI. We already see research such as in material science and medicine benefited so much from AI and through the discovery of new chemicals or drugs. And in the future, when we fully automate scientific research with AI, whether physical hands-on lab research or remote research, and given the exponential progress we have already seen in AI capabilities, like how do you envision science funding evolving, and how might this affect Renaissance Philanthropy strategy now and in the future?
You know, I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think that at least we are currently quite excited about the intersection between AI and science, that there's a huge potential in um, accelerating scientific discovery with AI, whether it's, the intersection with self-driving labs and sort of automated tooling that pairs up with the ability to do automated experiments, whether it's um, engaging in novel hypothesis design, whether it's using AI to build more signaling between really diverse research disciplines. And, I think there's a lot of, or in just, building more scientific benchmarks so that you can improve the prediction tasks of AI in a particular area. So I think there's like a lot of potential. I think the question of like, oh, if we really start to get super intelligent AI systems and they were able to do lots of science, what does that mean for, what pieces of science would you then want to fund? You know, my general view is like, you know, um, I don't think we're running out of problems anytime soon. And so, as components of that scientific architecture get more automated or more intelligent, you know, the research community and, the infrastructure will level up and people will ask, you know, bigger, wider, more interesting and additional questions. So there's so much to know and there's so much more to discover that um, uh, it it will definitely change how funding happens, but I'm not that worried about like us running out of problems anytime soon. So it could mean that like, and this is happening already, like scientists are sometimes very compute constrained, right? They want to run more experiments. I don't have access to compute. So it might change, you know, what is the cost structure of a scientific enterprise? It might change, you know, what you have to pay for and everything else. But that's always changing, Like I think if if you were doing astronomy a couple hundred years ago, you were building your own telescopes, and now the astronomical community gets together and help design what should go on the next rocket. So it has a totally different workflow for scientific instrumentation today compared to earlier. That doesn't mean like there's not interesting stuff to do. It just means like everyone's ambitions kept going up.
One thing I wanted to ask was not related to how we can leverage funding to make a lot of progress on important issues, but more related to how we can increase the amount of philanthropic funding available. So I was listening to this podcast by Tom Khalil recently, and yeah, one of the hosts at that podcast heard this idea. Matt Clancy was the person who said this, I think. I think there is roughly 2,000 families in the US with wealth over $500 million. And on average, it looks like those families give away a shade over 1% per year. So, like looking at this quote, like I don't think it's like abnormal for people to not donate a lot of their wealth. But again, 1% also seems really low. So what I wanted to ask you is like, in your view, what is the main binding constraint when it comes to this issue of wealthy families not giving that much, or like giving relatively trivial percentages of their wealth? Like, is it like what how big of a role does the following factor play? Probably doing philanthropy, at least like efficient philanthropy, takes up a lot of time and it requires extensive expertise. So you have a high entry barrier. But is that the main factor, or is it the lack of compelling ideas, or like is it the lack of compelling communication strategies that would convince these people, or something that's totally different?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know in the sense of there's an old adage, if you met one philanthropist, you met one philanthropist. But one of the things from that Bridgespan study is that they did ask, like, and people said, well, one of the dynamics that they sort of pointed out was that um, it's just hard to do it. Like and they were, they sort of have two major reasons. One is I'm busy, and the second is that um, uh, like I'm so professionally active and I might not have time for this. And the second was, like the deal flow isn't good enough. Like I'm not coming across enough compelling ideas. But in my mind, those are all the same basic thing, which is just, I'm not yet ready to make this my job, and so that would imply, and at least this is how we've structured Renaissance, that cognitive load, like what is your amount of time you can devote to this is a huge constraint. That it often stops people, science and tech, even especially because it has expertise barrier and everything else. It just stops people from getting going. And so part of the reason why we think more about building philanthropic funds, and we really say, we want the donors we work with to treat themselves like LPs, they're investing into the fund, is that like it doesn't mean they're not doing anything. They're like saying, is this a good idea that I want to back? Is this the right leader? But then the monitoring costs are much lower. They're just deploying the resources and, we're figuring out the rest. And so I don't think that's going to solve the whole problem, but I think the thing to always remember is that different people are looking for different things. And so it could be that there's a type of philanthropist that is very involved. They want to really dig into the details and really drive the strategy. In the investment world, that would be like the equivalent of direct investing, right? Like the angel investor, the direct investor, they're really involved in they want to provide coaching and help and resources. But then there's also the equivalent of the LP, where they're deploying large amounts of resources. They just want to pick good investment professionals, the right venture capital fund, the hedge fund, the private equity fund. And that's the relationship they want to have. And I think philanthropy would be benefited if we were giving people many different lanes for how they could be active. And right now, I think, philanthropy has been kind of historically contingent. It started with Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller and others, where, it's a very well thought of model, right? Which is I'm going to build an expert staff, and that expert staff is going to drive my grant making. It has led to a lot of our successes as a field, but it is a very upfront, time-intensive, cost-intensive model to build out that culture, that team, that structure. And so, are there additional types of models one could build out that don't require as much, but still allow you to sort of do edge giving? And what I would say is like the kind of field leader, model, the kind of the fund model, it's more emulative of like the DARPA model, right? So DARPA is able to operate, a $3 billion budget, but it has 200 staff. And most of the DARPA program managers are on 5-year rotations, and then they go off and do something else. So they are able to like build new programs and topics and cycle to new topics as a matter of structure. That's just how they do it. And so they're able to be pretty lean while still investing at the edge, just in the way that they've structured themselves. So there's nothing wrong with a different structure, but I think philanthropy would benefit if it also had some of that more thesis-led, thesis-driven, leader-led fund model as an option for donors.
Thank you very much. So if our participants have any quick questions, we may take those. So unfortunately, my question is a bit big, but feel free to specify one part of it and answer that part. So much of Renaissance Philanthropy's work, and in general, as far as I can see, R&D policy work is focused on the United States and the United Kingdom. And like talent and wealth is very important for cutting edge innovation and R&D. So I do understand that, but how do you think about the value of R&D and innovation programs in LMICs, or basically there's this cluster of questions that you and people at Renaissance Philanthropy thinks about the LMIC analog of those questions. How important do you think are they basically? Like thinking about increasing and improving R&D in middle-income countries like India, China, and Brazil. Do you think that is an important thing to be exploring and think about?
Yeah, um, we're pretty active on the India side, and have been talking a lot to. I mean, India is building a pretty interesting and growing set of ambitions on building out their R&D enterprise. This active conversation on building out the equivalent of the National Science Foundation for India. There's a lot of research institutes that are popping up all over, and we've been sort of actively tracking it. It's been pretty interesting. In Brazil, we know some of the donors that are in Brazil, and there's a lot of interest there. So I mean, my sort of view is that you want to certainly be encouraging the development of deep research ecosystems in more places, partly because I think talent is really distributed globally. So, that creates a lot of opportunity. I think the second is just that, like, different parts of the world care about different things, like I think, what research questions those enterprises want to go after. I also think just, you know, it should be a font for lots of interesting global cooperation, like we find that there's like lots of interest in sort of like building linkages between the UK and the US system, or the India and the US system, and others. So I think there should be an area for opportunity. So I just think that you have to grow these strategies out. I think people sometimes think there's like one weird trick, like, oh, if we just did this, we could have our next Silicon Valley. And it's just like there's no, like, you have to actually build these ecosystems out by investing in the talent, giving them opportunities to come up with big ideas, investing in those ideas, helping those ideas commercialize, building a capital network. People try to jam through all the steps of building out a really active ecosystem in one move. And it's just like, that's not how it's going to happen. And so the advice I give is that you should, you should think of it as like building an ecosystem, and that requires a multi-part strategy, but also requires like investing iteratively, rather than one move, like, oh, we built this big fund that's going to fund deep tech startups. We're going to call it a day, it's not going to do it.
Thank you. And now we would like to open it up to our audience. Please jump in if you have any questions.
Thanks a lot. My question is, what do you think about the possibilities of using something like advanced market commitments to get technologies that help us with developing and deploying artificial intelligence that we don't yet know how things are going to work out? And what your thoughts are on this kind of topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, in general, the problem advanced market commitments are trying to solve is when you have a diffuse, you have a large social return, but the economic returns are like sort of widely distributed in a way that the price signal is really like hard to pick up. So, the case example that people use is the development of the pneumococcal vaccine, where the ability for families to pay for that vaccine in Africa was really small. So vaccine manufacturers just were not that interested in building it. But once you sort of said, hey, if you build something, we will buy 1 billion doses, it sort of focused the energy. So I think the question would be, are there problems where the value signal, so like a good one, I think, in the AI space would be like monsoon prediction. So like, there's lots of interesting work happening at the intersection of AI and weather. You could imagine that if we could make the prediction of the monsoon way more accurate, it would actually help a lot of smallholder farmers, make sure that they got their crops out in time. But like the chance that like right now they individually could pay for that extra, like they probably could if you like aggregated that and said, what would you pay for if you could know when the monsoon was coming? But like no one has yet put that price signal together. So you could imagine somebody saying like, there's billions of dollars of value in better monsoon prediction. Could we build an AMC that leverages AI to solve it? And then the Indian government plus others sort of pay for that. So I think there's like those kind of applications where the aggregate benefit is really large, but there's not like somebody who could just sort of sit around and say, we're going to assemble 1 million farmers to collectively pay for it.
Thank you very much. We have one final quick question, and that is, what is one book, essay, or a blog post that had a significant impact in how you think about improving the world?
Oh, that's a good question. I, one, like sort of there's like a number of different books that I sort of like very early on found when I was kind of working at the White House, I found super useful. One that was like was focused on startup communities. It was written by the founder of Techstars. And what was really interesting about it was he was sort of describing the story of Boulder and just like how they got the startup ecosystem going. And what was fascinating was just that it brought together a lot of the pieces of the American story. Like, oh, we had a university. Oh, we had some folks who had done well, who were interested in being angel investors. Oh, we had a bunch of techies. But like, how do you actually build out the Boulder ecosystem that eventually led to a bunch of like startup activity and others? So I'll dig up a link and send it to you. But I found that just like a super interesting example of somebody talking about one very microcosm, but like, I was like, oh, like, what would this, like, there's a lot of analogies to this at the national level.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us.
We really appreciate you joining us, for making the time, and for all your so many thoughtful, inspiring answers.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
Happy to do it. And thanks for putting this together.